Welcome to Olmstead Day. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate disability advocacy in honor of the Olmstead Decision. We will begin our celebration with opening words from Commissioner Ho, who is the Commissioner of the Minnesota Housing State Agency, and a special greetings from the Minnesota Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. After that, we will share more about why we are here, and Director Aisha Elmquist of the Olmstead Implementation Office will share her greetings. Lastly, we have three fabulous speakers with us today: Dr. Colleen Wieck, David Dively, and Brittanie Hernandez-Wilson. Each of them will give presentations followed by a short break, and then we will have a panel discussion. Now I turn it over to Commissioner Ho of Minnesota Housing.
Hi there. Well, first of all, I just want to say happy Olmstead Day, everyone. My name is Jennifer Ho. I am the Commissioner of Minnesota Housing, and I'm also the chair of the state's Olmstead Subcabinet. I am a late 50s woman of mixed race, and as of this morning, almost no hair. I decided it was time for a change for the summer. And I'm standing here in my Minnesota Housing golf shirt in my Minnesota Housing office. So great to be with you all today. The Olmstead Subcabinet that I chair is a body of 13 state agencies and departments, and we oversee the goals in the state's Olmstead Plan. We ensure that these goals are being met, and we work with agency leaders and the public to make sure that the Olmstead Plan goals are a reflection of the wants and needs of the disability community. In the coming months, you'll have many opportunities to share your feedback with the subcabinet as we envision an updated plan. But today, we're celebrating the 1999 Supreme Court decision that brought us here today. 25 years ago, Elaine Wilson and Lois Curtis opened the door for millions of Americans to access their rights. The Olmstead Plan continues this work in Minnesota, and I'm really proud to be a part of its continuing success. And now we have a video greeting from the governor's office. A thank you to Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan for sharing a greeting with us all on Olmstead Day.
Happy Olmstead Day, Minnesota. 25 years ago, Elaine Wilson and Lois Curtis won a historic case against a system that wasn't created for them or by them. In Minnesota, here, it's called the Olmstead Plan, and it continues their legacy. You know, we've accomplished a lot in the last 25 years, but we do have more to do to ensure that every Minnesotan can live a full, integrated life in their community. I look forward to what we can accomplish together in the next 25 years. Thank you.
I just gratitude to the Lieutenant Governor, but now I also have the honor of reading a State of Minnesota proclamation. Whereas on June 22, 1999, the Supreme Court announced its decision in Olmstead v. LC, ruling that Americans with disabilities must receive services in the most integrated settings possible, and whereas 25 years later, Minnesota celebrates the Olmstead Decision and the rights against people with disabilities to live, work, and enjoy life in their chosen communities. Whereas we honor the two women with disabilities at the center of the Olmstead Decision who fought for their basic human right to live in a safe, affordable housing of their choice, and in doing so, unlocked access for millions of Americans to follow suit. And whereas we acknowledge Minnesota's complicity in the long history of isolation and discrimination, people with disabilities, and the systemic barriers that must still be addressed as we create more equitable, inclusive, and accessible communities. And whereas we honor the steps taken so far as a result of the relentless advocacy of individuals with disabilities, including the creation of the Minnesota Olmstead Plan, which has helped set the course for people in Minnesota living with disabilities to have options and make self-directed decisions about every area of their lives. And whereas there is still work to be done to ensure that every person in Minnesota living with disabilities can enjoy life in their communities. And whereas we celebrate every individual with disabilities who has fought for equal rights, access, and self-determination. Because of this advocacy, more people with disabilities are on the path toward living, working, and enjoying life in the community, and Minnesota is a better place for everyone. Now, therefore, I, Tim Walz, Governor of Minnesota, do hereby proclaim Saturday, June 22nd, 2024 as Olmstead Day in the state of Minnesota. In witness whereof, I have hereto set my hand and caused the great seal of the state of Minnesota to be affixed at the state capitol this 21st day of June. Tim J. Walz, Governor. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Lieutenant Governor, for joining us via video from the Governor's office. And for the Commissioner's reading of the proclamation of being our sub-cabinet Olmstead, wishing all of us a happy Olmstead Day. It is imperative that we have allies at every level of government partnering with us to build a more equitable Minnesota. My name is Nikki Villavicencio. I use she, her, sha pronouns, and I am your MC for this event. Today, I am wearing a blue jean shirt, and I have purple and blue glasses and long brown hair. I get to work at ACT, Advocating Change Together, the Center for Disability Leadership. I, being the disability culture and leadership specialist, puts me at the front line of building the self-advocacy movement. As the chair of the Minnesota Council on Disability, I get to see what happens statewide. And as a Maplewood City Council member, I see how government plays an important role in our everyday lives. At ACT, the Center for Disability Leadership, we offer several programs for people with disabilities to build self-advocacy and leadership skills. One of our programs is the Olmstead Academy. The Olmstead Academy is a year-long training program focused on disability rights, integration, and the Olmstead Decision. This year's participants are well on their way to fulfilling their integration projects. ACT will also be hosting the second annual Disability Pride Festival on Thursday, July 18th, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at the Minnesota State Capitol, North Lawn. The Disability Pride Fest is an opportunity for the community to celebrate their whole selves and their identities. We will have music, activities, open mic, and we will be joined by many of our community partners, including the Olmstead Implementation Office. This is a free event and no registration is required. 25 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court released its decision on Olmstead versus LC. The Olmstead decision affirms the rights of people with disabilities under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Unjustified segregation of people with disabilities in institutions is discrimination. And the decision further emphasizes that we have the right to live and receive services in the community instead of segregated settings. Today, we celebrate the important role Olmstead has played in shaping our rights as disabled people. We also honor the commitment to the serious work that still needs to happen for our communities to be truly integrated. Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson were two women with developmental disabilities who were both forced to live in the psychiatric unit at the Georgia Regional Hospital. Although mental health professionals deemed them ready to live in the community-based programs, they remained institutionalized for several years. Lois and Elaine used a lot of disability advocacy skills like persistence and tenacity with the Atlanta Legal Aid, ultimately bringing their case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Their success also secured rights for millions of disabled Americans who would come after them. Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson paved the way for disability inclusion, but the work is not done. We must work side by side, continually breaking down barriers and disrupting systems that oppress us. In honor of Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson, today's theme is disability advocacy. Our three main speakers today are all leaders of the disability advocacy. As advocates, they have also educated, uplifted, and empowered people statewide to become advocates. They will ground us in the history of disability advocacy, the current environment, and help us envision a future for disability advocacy in years to come. Minnesota started on its Olmstead Plan in 2012. The first state formed the Olmstead Planning Committee. The state first formed the Olmstead Planning Committee. And in 2013, the governor established the Olmstead Subcabinet. Then, in 2015, the governor further defined the subcabinet and the Olmstead Implementation Office. Then again, in 2019, the governor furthered the roles and added members. The subcabinet has over 30 goals that focus on integrating Minnesotans with disabilities. The plan is currently being re-envisioned for a better reflection of the goals and rights of all disabled Minnesotans. And now I'm going to turn it over to Aisha Elmquist, Director of the Olmstead Implementation Office, to share more about the Minnesota's Olmstead Plan.
Thank you, Nikki. Good afternoon and happy Olmstead Day. My name is Aisha Elmquist, and I'm the Director of the Olmstead Implementation Office, or OIO. Thank you for joining our office today as we celebrate disability advocacy. I'm a blonde white woman in her 40s wearing glasses and a white shirt. There are so many people throughout the history of Minnesota and the nation that we could acknowledge today. At OIO, we center Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson as leading the way for the Olmstead Decision and all that followed. There are many others whose advocacy led to the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Minnesota Human Rights Act, the Rehabilitation Act, the IDEA, and so many other important civil rights laws. And disability advocates move us more every day toward ending ableism, inaccessibility, institutional barriers, and discrimination. Nikki shared about ACT's Center for Disability Leadership. Learning more about the Partners in Policymaking program, Minnesota Council on Disabilities Exceptional Advocate Awards, and many other great resources in our state are just some of the many ways to learn more about disability advocacy happening in our state and moving us closer to justice, equity, and inclusivity. We're also at an exciting next phase of the Olmstead Plan. The Olmstead Subcabinet, made up of state agencies, is in the process of re-envisioning the Olmstead Plan. We have opportunities to share your ideas for the Olmstead Plan with us through virtual and in-person community conversations, as well as through written feedback and more. Right now, we have the Disability Inclusion and Choice Survey, which is open through June 30th. And if you have not responded, please consider doing so. Your responses to the survey will help identify themes and changes for the next plan. We'll also have community conversations, and we'll be working with paid consultants who will be members of the disability community with lived experience to co-create the next plan alongside state agency leaders. And we're excited to announce that the request for proposal for a contractor for that work went out yesterday. The consultants will include people with disabilities, including those who have been or currently are in segregated settings. And we recognize the importance of co-creating the next plan with people with disabilities, including those most impacted by the Olmstead Decision. We also are aware of the importance of considering intersectionality in the next plan and how multiple forms of inequity and inequality intersect. This next plan will focus on protecting and securing the right of people with disabilities to live, learn, work, and enjoy life as they choose in their communities, which is at the heart of the Olmstead decision and what Elaine Wilson and Lois Curtis were fighting for. You can sign up for the Olmstead newsletter to learn more about these opportunities with the next plan over the coming year. And now today, as we celebrate disability advocacy, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Our speakers are Dr. Colleen Wieck of the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities, David Dively of the Minnesota Council on Disability, and disability advocate Brittanie Hernandez-Wilson. To ground ourselves in the important history of disability advocacy, Dr. Colleen Wieck will give us a look at what came before us. Colleen is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities, a position that she has held for more than 40 years. One aspect of her work at the Council includes leading the Partners in Policymaking program, that is a groundbreaking advocacy and leadership training program to give people with disabilities and their families the resources and skills to communicate effectively with elected officials. Since 1987, more than 1,100 self-advocates and family members have graduated from Partners in Policymaking in Minnesota. And with that, I will turn it over to Colleen.
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you for inviting me. This is such a kind introduction. I am a white female wearing glasses, blue blazer and top. My pronouns are she and her. And these slides come from educational banners that we've got posted at the top of our DD Council's website. Since Minnesota became a state in 1858, I want to point out how long we've waited for rights. People with disabilities have waited 116 years for the right to treatment, 117 years for the right to education, 123 years for the right to live in a neighborhood, 132 years for basic civil rights, the Americans with Disabilities Act, 141 years for the right to most integrated setting, the Olmstead Decision, 153 years to be free from restraint and seclusion, and 154 years for the right to vote. Now, some of you are multitasking right now, and so time is critical. And today, waiting is measured in seconds, not in years, not in decades, and not in centuries. But what we've asked people with disabilities to do is to wait. The next slide is a photo I've taken at the Minnesota History Center, and they have a registry of those people who were institutionalized. I'm going to talk about the very first person with a disability who was a 16-year-old girl. Her name was Mary Miller, and on February 14th, 1867, she was the first person with a disability admitted to the St. Peter Asylum. Mary was diagnosed as having epilepsy, but she was also called feeble-minded and demented. The institution didn't know what to do with Mary, so they discharged her to her family. And upon his deathbed, her dad admitted that he had drowned her in a river. Let's go to the next slide. I have 3 photos of institutions, the exterior, crowded beds, and the interior, and then some young boys working in a workshop. As I mentioned, Minnesota established the first hospital for the insane. That was the language at the time in 1866. And then there were several institutions built after that in Faribault, Rochester, Fergus Falls, Anoka, plus more. The state would take custody. The parents would give up their rights, and the state would place them in institutions, taking them away from their families and their local communities. And in the beginning, people thought that the institution was the training school. But as the population would increase, and if the staffing stayed the same, the education and training went was just abandoned. And people then were treated more like prison inmates in custodial care. The residents were forced to work for free to support the institutions, which were often farms. Next slide. So during the early 1900s, all the way up to the 1970s, the United States and Minnesota were taken up by eugenics and dehumanization practices. Eugenics is the mistaken belief that we can build a better human race by institutionalizing people with disabilities, by segregating them, and by sterilization. So in the state of Virginia, Carrie Buck was a 17-year-old woman committed to a state institution. And Carrie wanted to get out. And they said, if you want to get out, you have to be sterilized according to their state statute. She brought her case to the US Supreme Court, and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes authored the opinion. He callously wrote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And so Carrie was sterilized. Her mother, Emma, was sterilized. Emma was living in the same state institution. And Carrie's baby, Vivian, was only a few months old, but they had also diagnosed her as having feeble-mindedness. The Nazis came to America to study our practices, and then they adopted these practices in Germany. We've developed a documentary called Hadamar, The Forgotten Holocaust, and it's about 20 minutes, and it explains how the Nazis adopted the US policies. Next slide. I'm going to jump forward to 1948. And this young reporter from the Minneapolis Tribune, Jerry Joseph, decided to go live in state institutions for 10 days. She then wrote a series of articles. And what grabbed Minnesota's attention was her description that the people in the state institutions weren't as clean as the pigsty. The pigs were treated better than people. And we've had several consultants from Scandinavian countries come to Minnesota in the 1960s. They would meet with the governor and say, Governor, we treat cattle better than you treat people. Now, all of Jerry Joseph's news articles are on our website. So if you're interested, you can read that series of articles. Next slide. The parents were the first to spring into action. So in 1950, 90 parents traveled to Minnesota to the Radisson Hotel in downtown Minneapolis, where they formed the very first parent association. And the governor at the time was Luther Youngdahl. He came in on a Saturday night at a banquet to address the families. And what he said was revolutionary because he talked about rights. He said, your children have the same rights as children everywhere. The right to happiness, the right to play, the right to companionship, the right to be respected, the right to develop to the fullest extent within capacity, the right to love and affection. And he has these rights for one simple reason: he is a child. This was 40 years before the ADA passed. Now, the parent movement was followed by the independent living movement. And Ed Roberts studied the other civil rights movements when he founded the independent living movement. Then came the self-advocacy movement. So the next slide shows you the peak of institutionalization in Minnesota. And we go back to 1961 when the institutions were overcrowded. That means there weren't enough beds. So people were sleeping on the floor. At that point, there were over 6,565 residents with 900 people on the waiting list to get into the institutions. Next slide. I talked to Sam Newland, who was a reporter for the Star Tribune, and Sam said he drove down to Faribault, he entered the institution, and there was no staff. And so I'm showing you 3 slides from that time period. And there are men simply sitting in chairs. There's a young boy with his face up against a mesh screen. And there's a young female who's doubled over and just on a bare floor. The headline at the time was "Some at Faribault Live Like Animals." And in that time period, the Department of Labor, and there were lawsuits about patient labor. And so instead of hiring people with disabilities to be the laborers and to pay them more than $1 a month, the decision was made to lay off all people. And so we had enforced idleness. Next slide. In 1972, Richard Welsh went to visit his daughter Patty at Cambridge. And he got through the locked doors, found his daughter, probably in restraint and naked and drugged. And the next day he traveled to the Minneapolis Legal Aid Society to file a lawsuit against the state of Minnesota. And that lawsuit lasted from 1972 until 1989. On this slide, I'm showing you images. You can see in the upper photo cribs, which actually turned into cages. We've got the restraint, jacket. We've got the fellow that I testified in 1980. He's wearing a helmet because he had bitten an ear. And so he was told, we can either pull your teeth or you can wear a hockey helmet 24 hours a day. And then we have the restraint chair. The restraint chair is secured to a piece of plywood so no one could tip over. Next slide. And so I'm showing you the timeline. And the lawsuit, as I said, started in 1972 when there were about 4,000 adults and children in state institutions. In 1982, 10 years later, we had 282 children with disabilities still housed. In 1983, 66 children. Then DHS created a state plan. And because of the work of Ann Henry and so many others, there were 0 children in state institutions in 1987. And please compare that with other states where we still see children institutionalized. Governor Perpich announced a plan to, to make sure everyone could live in the community by 1999. And with the lawsuit ended in 1989, we still had over 1,400 people. And so the last 3 residents were able to leave in 1999. And the last person leaving a large state institution, which was Fergus Falls, was in July 2000. Next slide. So where did people go? Well, in the beginning, as soon as Medicaid became available, people would leave the institution to go to what was called intermediate care facilities. And at that time, the old language was MR. And they would often be 15-bed units, and it could be 15 beds, 45 beds, 60 beds. And it was like a step down from a nursing home. But the real change occurred with the waiver when Minnesota adopted a waiver plan. Next slide. The key federal laws, of course, that underpin all of this would be Section 504 of the Rehab Act. And we have to give credit to Hubert Humphrey. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and of course, Governor Quee was the minority sponsor. This was based upon Brown versus Board of Education and a federal lawsuit in Pennsylvania. And then, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. And I'm showing you photos of the Capitol crawl that occurred in March 1990, and then a photo from the reopening of the state capitol when Senator Dave Durnberger and Justin Smith and I were all on a panel together. And Senator Durnberger was the minority sponsor of the ADA. Next slide, please. So we get to the Olmstead decision, and why was this critical? If you look back to the ADA in that time period, people were just thinking ramps. We're just going to build ramps, and somehow the ADA was going to be implemented. The Olmstead decision was critical because it applied the ADA to Medicaid policy. Up to that point, people with developmental disabilities weren't really thought about with the Americans with Disabilities Act. But Lois and Elaine and all the preceding lawsuits about people being placed in nursing homes and Medicaid applying to, with the ADA applying to Medicaid, that made the difference. Next slide, please. Here's Governor Luther Youngdahl. We're going back to 1949 for a reason. He's out burning restraints in a bonfire on Halloween at the Anoka State Hospital. And he says, we're free from these restraints forever. It was not true. And the report he received said that restraint was often used as a substitute for treatment. Here's my last slide. Roberta Opine, former ombudsman for mental health and developmental disabilities, said the same thing. In her report, she said restraint at a facility in Cambridge is not treatment. And so that report led to a lawsuit filed on behalf of their son, James and Lori Jensen, filed on behalf of Bradley, and then 3 other families. And this alleged the use of mechanical restraints and seclusion as a violation of all the preceding laws and so forth. And so Judge Donovan Frank approved the Jensen settlement agreement in 2011. And as part of that settlement agreement, we included the provision about an Olmstead plan needed to be developed and implemented. And then in 2015, Judge Frank approved the Olmstead plan. And so our council developed an Olmstead chronology, and we have provided details of the sub-cabinet actions. We also have a chronology of all of the court orders for the Jensen decision. And so those of you who are interested in history and how we got to where we are, because this presentation could be so much longer, I just refer you to our council's website. And so thank you, and I'll turn it back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Colleen Wieck. It is so important to know our history and where we come from and the hard-fought rights that we have been securing. But we all know that disability advocacy did not end with the ADA, the Olmstead Decision, or the Minnesota's Olmstead Plan. And our next speaker, David Dively. David is the Executive Director of the Minnesota Council on Disability, or MCD. He comes from deaf parents who use American Sign Language, has several disabilities, and is a parent of an autistic child. Disability advocacy is both personal and professional for him. Previous to his position at MCD, Dively served 4 years at the Minnesota Commission of the Deaf, Deafblind, and Hard of Hearing as the Deputy Director and Interim Executive Director. And prior to that, as the director of the largest ASL interpreting agency in Southern California. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you to everyone for being here today. My name is David Dively, and my visual description, I'm a white male with glasses. I'm bald. I'll have a black sweater on, and my background is the state of Minnesota Capitol. Thank you to Director Aisha Elmquist and the Olmstead team for inviting me here, and for our MC, Nikki, and other panelists for being here. It's a pleasure to work with you and to be with all of you today. So like you heard from other folks, how important it is for us to emphasize who Lois Clark and Elaine Wilson were, I want to also just reiterate that their personal advocacy was so impactful. It's a huge landmark where segregation is discrimination, where we now can really enforce the rights of being in home and community, least restrictive settings, integrated policy. These are all milestones that are really recent in our history in Minnesota and in the United States. A little bit, you heard a lot actually, sorry, of the disability history and advocacy in Colleen Wieck's wonderful speech just before mine. And I'm gonna just quickly mention a couple things in that light before we move on to where we are currently. There's an excellent video series on the Governor's Council for Developmental Disabilities site. Alan Bergman has a series that I'd highly recommend to everybody here called Bending the Arc of Disability History Towards Rights, Freedom, Social Justice, and Belonging. And the reason why I think it's so important that we're aware of our history and where it comes from is because so many of the issues that we work with on advocacy repeat themselves. And we can learn a lot of lessons from how people worked through them in the past and how we can find parallels to find solutions in the future. It's been a big benefit for all of us who have learned and focused on those things. You know, if you think of where we came from disability rights being focused on veterans who came back from wars who are disabled and having physical access to facilities such as transportation and buses, we've come a long way to, as Colleen mentioned, really applying anti-discrimination to our services and programs, not just to our buildings and our areas that we all live in. And this change is really meaningful because now we don't talk about those things that way anymore, right? We talk about human rights and civil rights, and our lens has changed. And what that happened, how that happened rather, was learning from the civil rights era that other folks who fought for their rights in the 50s and 60s have really showed us how this large coalition of people with different goals and ideas and things can come together and make significant change. And because today is we're celebrating the Olmstead Day, I want to take a mention to talk about how the Americans with Disabilities Act was also similarly structured, where the advocates who are pushing for this refused to allow this to be a disability-specific issue, and they kept it much more general than that and inclusive of everyone. And they stood their ground and would not compromise when people were trying to limit which disabilities the Americans with Disabilities Act would apply to. And I think there's a lot of lessons in that I want to kind of pivot to here, which is that I think really effective long-term disability rights is largely disability inclusive. Of course, there's always needs for specific disability policies, and it's nonpartisan. It's very bipartisan. And as you heard from Colleen Wieck, that many of the bills and the issues, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, had significant sponsors and supporters from both major political parties. And because disability rights is not a given, it is something we have to continue to push for, fight for, earn, maintain, and keep. Having things that both parties, all people of walks of life can believe in and support is really important to continuing to build on those successes and moving them forward instead of moving backwards. We know that folks from all walks of life, whether it's income, geography, where they politically believe in, what kind of disabilities they have people with disabilities in all of those communities. And so our laws and our rights need to reflect that. I say quite a bit that disabled folks may interact with and depend on government more than anybody else who is a civilian in the United States. And for that reason, I think it's so important that we all are advocates for the rights that we need for education, for employment, for housing, for transportation, many of the things that our Olmstead plan and our Olmstead office focuses on in their goals. Deinstitutionalization is a form of discrimination. So ensuring that we can't segregate people is a Supreme Court opinion. And that means that it may not last forever. And we have to continue to push and fight for maintaining, protecting, and solidifying those rights. In Minnesota now, we have had disability advocacy for well over 50 years. And at the Minnesota Council on Disability for 50 years, that is both disability inclusive and nonpartisan. I want to switch to a little bit here to talk about how we can use our state in Minnesota now to make change and advocate for folks with disabilities in our communities. Boards, councils, and commissions. There are over 200 boards, councils, and commissions in our state government that apply to many things, very few of which actually are specific to disability issues. A recent Olmstead Implementation Office study showed that only 6% of people who are appointed to any board, council, and commission, all those groups that the state hosts, are people who self-identify as having a disability. Those are people who are at the table advising and providing input about how we should structure and do the work of our government. And we need people with disabilities voices in those conversations. Continuing that, I would encourage all of you to speak to your elected officials about the concerns that you have, the priorities that you have, to legislators, to the governor's office. Minnesota has a strong bipartisan support for disability policy. So every single one of your voices and every single one of your representatives, senators, and people who you support matter in these conversations. It takes a large coalition to make big structural change. I would also encourage you to participate in town halls and other civic engagement activities. Show them that there are people in your communities who care and who need and who support, who need the support of these programs and services. It's not other people far away who they don't know, but people in their own communities who these issues are really important to. It shows your fellow citizens, all the people around you, that these issues are local and they're not other people somewhere else. I'd also recommend that you ask questions during these town halls. Raise your hand. What's your position on these issues? And get them on the record and hearing the attendees also hearing how important it is for them, hopefully. And these are ways that we can not only advocate to our government, but also to our communities. Join a coalition. Minnesota has many disability-focused nonprofit organizations that have a very strong self-advocacy arm, and you've heard of some of them today, including Advocating Change Together and others. The Minnesota Council on Disability, along with the Minnesota Commission on of the Deaf, Blind, and Hard of Hearing, are 2 state agencies as well. But beyond that, there's also organizations that serve and support the deaf communities in Minnesota, the blind communities in Minnesota, autistic communities in Minnesota, and so on and so forth, from brain injuries and epilepsy and so on and so forth. These are tremendously important tools that all of you would be well suited to find those that align with the things you're trying to accomplish and join those coalitions. A lot of advocacy really is a game of numbers. And if we have 5 people saying something, and then we have 1,000 people saying something, it really does make a difference. And so finding opportunities where you can agree with people, build those coalitions of support and act on it are incredibly meaningful. Many of you, as Colleen mentioned nicely, have been waiting for a long time. Many of these rights have been decades or even over a century in the making. So the issues are about now. But at the same time, we also need to acknowledge that government is hard to change. The services and programs and rights are structural, big changes that we're making. And I think of government like a big cruise liner, right? As opposed to a little speedboat. And sometimes that means that we're making changes that are only a few degrees at a time, but over months and years, hopefully they're adding up to significant changes in that arc over time. And so many of the changes that we advocate for are going to be incremental changes that advance rights and services, protections for people. And I'm asking for all of you to not necessarily have patience with us as we try to push for these things, but just to be realistic that we're trying to build consensus, try to get people to agree with us who don't always agree with us, and to make changes that will stay and that we'll continue to move forward with. And sometimes they are incremental, even though I know many folks would like to have transformational quick change, of course. I want to highlight a couple very important summer engagement activities that people can do to show their advocacy for themselves and their communities. At the Twin Cities Pride Festival, among others, are many elected officials. At the Minnesota State Fair, there are many elected officials, including exhibiting areas for both the Senate and the House of Representatives, along with many other state agencies. These are core opportunities for you to meet people face to face and share what matters to you. Talk about your stories. The stories are so important. People can have technical understanding and legal understanding, and that doesn't go that far without the stories to say how they make a difference. And so your stories of your experiences and your issues and your concerns are absolutely necessary to making these changes. And in places like the State Fair, they can be amazing opportunities to have the ear and the eyes and the attention of people who are in positions making some of these choices. And I'd encourage you to take advantage of that. And then briefly at the local level here in Minnesota, there are mayor's advisory groups for cities. There are human rights commissions in your cities and counties. These are all opportunities to extend the disability rights advocacy into local government, including school districts that have special education groups and pushing about your passions and caring for accessible facilities, school grounds, and playgrounds. Disabled people in Minnesota are likely the largest block of citizens in Minnesota, of any community group in Minnesota. And that means that your vote, you participating in census counts, engaging in advocacy, all of these are incredibly important ways so that our government reflects the power and the numbers of the people that we have here today. Your self-advocacy is incredibly important, and I would encourage all of you to look at opportunities that we've shared today, training materials such as on the Governor's Council for Developmental Disabilities, and others to find ways that you can make a change going forward. Happy Olmstead Day to everyone, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, David. Thank you for sharing more about our current state and centering us around where we're at right now as we continue the fight for our rights. Our final speaker today and before our panel discussion is Brittanie Hernandez-Wilson. Brittanie is a passionate advocate for disability and racial justice. She proudly identifies as a disabled woman of color, dedicating herself to disability justice and actively challenging ableism. Brittanie is the Equity and Justice Director at the ARC of Minnesota. She previously served on the Sub-Minimum Wage Task Force, the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities, and worked for the Minnesota Council on Disability. Welcome, Brittanie.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to be here today. Thank you to our host, the Olmstead Implementation Office, for inviting me to be here. As Nikki mentioned, my name is Brittanie Hernandez-Wilson. My pronouns are she, her. I am a Black and Mexican person sitting in my electric wheelchair. I am wearing a black and white striped dress with yellow and orange beaded flower earrings. I have brown skin with dark brown curly hair. I wanted to thank Dr. Colleen Wieck and David Dively for touching on so many important topics today. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach, because I don't want to keep repeating all the important, amazing things that have been said already. As I've listened today about our history and how Elaine and Lois fought to be free after living years in an institution, I can't help but think about how hard that was, living in a time when it was very common practice to be segregated and forced to live in an institution. I can't help but think about the people who never made it out, those who died in the facilities, who were often buried in unmarked graves. Did the people who worked there care? Did folks gather around and say words after people passed? Were stories about their lives shared? And were tears of love and remembrance shed? Were people given their flowers? Can we take a moment to give them their flowers? If you're able, on the bottom of your screen, can you select a flower emoji or some type of affirmation as we take a moment to remember the people who never made it out? Even though I'm speaking in the past, I know that many of these practices still happen today. I have friends who are being forced to make this impossible decision, who want to live in their community, know that they can live in their community, but do not have access to the support that is needed to do so. And I wanted to take a moment to think and reflect on folks that are in this situation, Minnesotans who are living this very real reality right now. I want to remind us that it is possible to carry the weight of many worlds at once. One where the Olmstead decision passed, where the plan is implemented, how it opened up so many more possibilities for folks in our community to actually live in their community. And I also believe that at the same time, we can and must acknowledge the fact that there are many in our community who are still living in some type of institution. And as we reflect on that, I also wanted to ask a question. What would it be like if we took time to build communities of care? How would building care webs feel? What kind of world would be possible if we were rooted in care? If our state waivers and systems were built on real care, person to person? If we all had options to rely on built networks outside of state solutions? I imagine and try to imagine and reimagine this world every day as I do this work alongside so many other incredible advocates and people working and fighting for systems of justice, for true solutions rooted in justice. And as we know, Olmstead was the beginning, and we have so much further to go. The right to live in our community involves addressing so many things, including our home care system, PCAs, care providers, and fully funding it. It also involves an actually accessible and easy to understand waiver system. I've been on the waiver system for decades, and I still get lost. It involves readily accessible and affordable housing systems. It means equity in our economic structures. And I truly mean that, because in our state, it's still fully legal to pay people in our community, people with disabilities, less than minimum wage just because they're disabled. It's also about addressing the fact that we are a state with some of the highest racial disparities. It's about acknowledging, re-acknowledging over and over again that ableism is real, that ableism kills, and that ableism harms and affects every single one of us, no matter how we identify. And that ableism is connected to all other forms of oppression. When I think about the future of disability advocacy, I think about what it would mean to truly embody our rally cry. Nothing about us without us is for us. How would it look? How would it feel? How would it be to fully embody that practice? Now and in the future, I want to see this movement being led by actual disabled people of all races, of all disability types, from every community, from every corner of our state. I hope that at next year's celebration, we have people here, up here, who have been institutionalized, who are currently in situations where they're not living in their community, because they must lead this movement. We must know their stories and their faces, just like we do with Lois and Elaine. As we celebrate today and reflect on the incredible achievements of our community, may we also continue to demand that our state and systems include all of us at the table, center us in their calculations. I dream of a world rooted in care, of a system rooted in giving people their flowers even before they pass on, in care practices that honor the life and legacy truly of people that pass. May we carry the torch that Lois and Elaine ignited, and may we never let the flames go out. We are all that we've got. And if history has taught us one thing, it's that we are all strongest when we work together with each other. May we do this work. May we center it in love, in care, and in justice, with no body mind left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittanie, for sharing your passion and existing in disability advocacy as we look towards the future. As we're moving into our panel discussion with Brittanie and David and Colleen, I will refer to them just in their first name and ask each question. So we've been really well grounded in our history and centered around where we're at and where we want our future to be in disability rights and disability justice. And I think what an awesome opportunity to dig in a little with these three panelists on this issue. As we have come together and seeing the importance of it. So we'll dig into the questions. I will ask for the first question, let's do we'll do Brittanie and then David and then Colleen, if that's okay. All right. So for our first question, what are barriers to disability advocacy? How can we make advocacy more accessible?
Hey everyone, this is Brittanie speaking. I think that there's a lot of really great information out there, including the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities, MCD, ARC. There's so many disability advocacy organizations that are doing this work that put information out. I think one of the biggest barriers is wading through that information, is trying to understand the legislative process, is understanding kind of even what our right is in that legislative process. I took partners in policymaking several years ago now, and it really ignited my passion for this work and really centered me in that. And I think that that program and programs like that are doing really instrumental work in making disability advocacy, fighting for our rights more accessible. But I think that we have a long way to go. I think a silver lining of some of the COVID practices were that all of the legislative hearings and things were online and you could join from anywhere. And I thought that that really helped open up accessibility. But I see a lot of that kind of going away at times. I think that funding for accessibility practices like ASL interpreters and other language interpretation services can cost a lot as well. And so I think having that accessible would help remove some of the barriers. I think about how much labor goes into just being a disabled person, period, and how much harder we often have to fight just to, receive the same quality of life as people who don't have disabilities. And I think that that is a huge barrier. It's often, as Dr. Colleen Wieck was saying, we're waiting years and years and years. And I think that can make it really difficult as well. It's just that time that it takes to make change. I think that something that I feel is also a barrier to disability advocacy is how overrun our state systems can be. I think that even if you have all the social capital in the world, it's still possible that, your services get cut. That happened to me this year for no reason. It was a mistake. And I think about if you don't speak English, if English is not your preferred language, how difficult it is to get access to these systems. And how you can leave all the voicemails in the world and sometimes still never get through to anybody. And I think that we have a lot of work to do for our state agencies to really be supported in the way that they need to be supported in order to support the community. So those are some things that are coming to mind to me, for me.
Yeah, thank you, Brittanie. That was a lot of good stuff. I'll add on to that. I think another barrier to disability advocacy we have, well, I should say that I'll caveat first by saying that in many ways we have fewer barriers to advocacy than we ever have. And Brittanie mentioned some of those, including some of the COVID practices, such as hybrid or remote participation. Obviously, we have larger federal civil rights laws in place. And so we do have, the right to be in a building and the right to have those sorts of things. But having said that, there are people who we still don't really hear from. There are people under guardianship, there are people institutionalized that their voices are incredibly important in the advocacy space. And also for those reasons, though, they're not able to always be a part of the conversations. So I'll say that that's a big barrier. The other thing I would say is that to make it more accessible, I would say ensuring that we encourage and continue to encourage hybrid meetings, allowing folks with disabilities to participate remotely, I think is a huge reasonable accommodation or accessibility improvement that we can really advocate for. And then lastly, I'll just say, like, our physical government space right now, while it's in progress to becoming more accessible, I would say in many ways it is not. Our Capitol Tunnel and other places are serious physical barriers that we're still working on and have taken a while to get through. And so those are a few ideas.
This is Colleen speaking, and of course, my two preceding speakers have ticked off so many things, but at the top of my list was the lack of stable funding for advocacy alone, because the billions of dollars we spend are often tied up in the status quo, the way the system is. A promising practice would be to build in self-advocacy, self-determination in all parts of the system. And the Department of Education did that in their transition curriculum, making sure that self-determination, self-advocacy is supposed to be part of transition. But we have way too many people who start out and they say, I'm lost, I don't know where to begin. We have people receiving the Bill of Rights when they enter services, but they don't know those are rights. They're handed that document. And then I was so glad when David listed all of the possibilities of advocacy, not only within disability, but in the generic system itself. And I have to make a pitch for partners in policymaking. Our applications are due July 12th, and this will be our 42nd class. And so with this group, we'll be reaching the 1,200 graduate mark, and we're in almost every county now. So thank you. Go ahead, Nikki.
Thank you, the three of you. The word that comes to mind as you were all speaking was inclusion. How can our advocacy be more inclusive? And I will also say that as a partners in policy making graduate, I highly recommend anybody going through partners in policy making. So, but with our next question, let's have David answer this first, and then Colleen, and then Brittanie, if that's okay. So the Olmstead Implementation Office is currently hosting the Disability Inclusion and Choice Survey, and we'll be conducting community conversations and contracting them with consultants with disabilities. And this engagement will help determine the goals and focus areas of the next plan. So what do you think the state needs to consider when creating the next Olmstead plan?
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. This is David speaking, and I'm going to go probably one level higher than specific goal, like measurements or specifics at that level, to say, so much of disability advocacy and how accessible government and services are is not necessarily in the laws. We have many, many laws that cover many bases that we need. How it's implemented and how they're rolled out, the actual rubber meeting the road part of policy, is really where a lot of challenges occur. It's much easier to pass a law. It's much, much harder to get the whole country on board or the whole state on board with those new changes. And we've seen that, like, for example, with the ADA, it's not new, it's decades old. It's still hard to get it to work, right? And so I think it's an important part to say, and that's why I like that we call it the Olmstead Implementation Office, because how we implement, how we do it matters just as much as what we have. And so I would say the one thing I would encourage all the people who are part of this process to do is to consider goals that are ambitious and bold. I think it's of course, it's hard to have goals that we're not as confident that we can make, but I think that taking some of that liberty to say we want to make these big picture, big dreamy goals sometimes is also really healthy. And while incremental change and improvements is important, I think we also want to challenge our leaders and our agencies to think big and think bold and to really push as far as they can.
this is Colleen speaking, and there is an art to this, because when you're listening to people, then you want to pull out, what have we learned? What are the nuggets? What are the actionable items? And then, as David said, taking the action and then the improvement cycle. And so I'm glad Commissioner Ho is still online with us, because at one of our sub-cabinet meetings, we discussed the idea, and David just mentioned this, aspirational goals, stretch goals, minimal goals. So I know that people want to reach the goals, so they'll probably set a goal that they know they can reach. But sometimes the feedback we receive tells us this isn't enough. Can't we do better than 1%? And so if we would think in those terms, can we have aspirational goals, stretch goals, and also the minimal goals, plus not being afraid to look at other states, because there are states like Washington that leads the nation in terms of competitive integrated employment. What they didn't do was deinstitutionalization. So our state chose that route, get everybody out of state institutions. Washington state still has people in institutions. They chose to go competitive integrated employment as their top priority. So over to you, Brittanie.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think that with the next Olmstead plan, I really want to see as many diverse people with disabilities being involved. I know that there's consultants, and I think that's great. I just wonder, are people with disabilities involved in every single step of the way? And if not, I think that would be something that is really important. I think that oftentimes we create a plan and then get people's input. And I just think that that should be the opposite, that we should start with people with disabilities really leading and creating it. I am often left to wonder who was really a part of this. Did they look like me? Do they have similar experiences to me? And I know that, you know, friends that I have with disabilities are wondering the same. I think we are so used to seeing like one type of person with a disability hold roles or be a part of the planning process. And I just, again, encourage all different types of diversity. I want to see more disabled people hired at OIO and other state organizations. I want to see more people with disabilities promoted in director positions and up. I think that the more that we can integrate diverse people with disabilities in all that we do, not just in consulting, but in everything that we do, the more better off that will be. I think that, you know, intersectionality is a big thing. And of course, disability is a part of every single community. And so I think it's really important that we understand how ableism is rooted and connected to all forms of oppression when we're doing this work. I believe wholeheartedly in disability justice and the principles of disability justice. And I'm curious if any of those are being integrated. I'm thinking about the people who may use screen readers. Are these materials accessible to them during this consultation process? I'm thinking about folks who may have intellectual and developmental disabilities or may speak other languages. Just curious if things are in plain language. I just wonder what the process is like that and is like, and if it is truly accessible for people of all disability types and backgrounds to actually be a part of it. And I'm saying this not knowing if that's the case, so I don't want to make assumptions. I'm just giving suggestions. Those are some things that are coming to mind for me.
Yeah, I appreciate all of your comments. I think, you know, I resonate with all of your comments, especially around the fact that a lot of times these plans, don't seem to speak to the everyday disabled person in Minnesota and all of the variety of who we are as people and our many identities. So for our next question, let's go with Colleen next, and then Brittanie, and then David. The next question is, why is it important to know the history of Olmstead and disability advocacy? I think a lot of a lot of today was already really well said about our history, but why is it important for us to know it and to share it with everyone else?
Thank you, Nikki. I think the reason we want to know history is that it does keep repeating itself. And so in 2026 will be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. One of the people who signed that declaration was Benjamin Rush, the first psychiatrist in the US, and he created the first restraint chair. He thought he would cure his brother of mental illness by placing his brother in this restraint chair. Restraint chairs still exist, and other practices still appear. For example, seclusion rooms today are called quiet rooms. They're called whisper rooms. They're called conference rooms. They're called sanctuaries, but they're seclusion rooms. They are often cages that people are put in. So you have to understand that, so that when people say, well, this is a brand new idea, it's good to know your history. And these practices go back thousands of years, not just decades, centuries, but thousands of years. If you know your history, you're going to know more than others. For example, we reviewed special education textbooks. There's probably one paragraph devoted to the history of special ed. But if you understand the history of special ed, you'll know about permissive education. You'll know how the Pennsylvania ARC had to file a lawsuit, which was based upon Brown versus Board of Education, which led to the Education Act. And then you're going to learn patience, because you're going to see how long it takes. So over to you, Brittanie.
Thank you. This is Brittanie speaking. I really appreciate you saying that. And I'm brought back to the first partners class that I had when Dr. Colleen Wieck spent a few hours going over disability history. It was the first time that I ever learned about my history, about part of my history. And I remember being so taken aback with grief, with anger, with rage, with sadness, with love, with care, and really thinking about how we've been fighting for thousands and thousands of years. And for me, I second all the things that Dr. Colleen Wieck said, but it gave me a feeling of not being alone. It gave me a feeling of I belong to a community. Disability is a community and a culture. And it made me, honestly, it empowered me to fight, because as much as we have to work, there's also so many other dark, really sad and disturbing chapters in our history. And it gives me encouragement and courage to keep fighting, to not go back there, because as Dr. Colleen Wieck said, history does repeat itself. And so for me, it just like fueled all my fire. And I think that it's so important for us to know that our history as a community, because we know that it's not readily taught in schools, that even though disability is a part of every community and we have different months to celebrate different things, that disabled people in those movements are silenced. And I think that in a way, we have to be the ones to carry our history, because no one else is. And we have to remind people over and over and over, like Dr. Colleen Wieck said. And I find encouragement, empowerment, love, and rage in our history.
This is David speaking. Well, Colleen and Brittanie really touched on a lot of things that I would say. So I'm just going to just briefly say that one of the lessons that I take from the Olmstead advocacy story, if you will, is that people doing self-advocacy don't know when that self-advocacy can result in a big system change instead of just their individual case being resolved to make it better, so to speak. And so all of your advocacy, you don't know which of the seeds you're planting in your advocacy end up growing into a big meaningful tree that makes long-term change. A lot of times that's not how it goes, but sometimes it does. And you'll never know what you're working on that might make those big changes. And then the other thing that I'll just briefly mention is a little bit of what Brittanie was saying, which is that I really enjoy learning the history because it not only teaches me what happened before, so I can learn what to look for into the future, but it also kind of roots me in a community of people bigger than myself, older than myself, longer than myself, and that I can be a part of something that's bigger than me. And I think that is really challenging because you want to live up to the amazing role models and leaders that have come before you, but also kind of gives you some comfort in that you're not alone, and that even though it can feel very lonely sometimes, it really is a patchwork of many people in many different places all over the country or even the world. And yeah, I'll pause there.
Thank you. And so for our last planned question, we'll do Brittanie, David, and Colleen again. What do you want the next generation of disability advocates and allies to know?
Disability justice advocate Mia Mingus talks about how unlearning and unpacking ableism is the work of every revolutionary activist, of every human being. And I think that that is something that's really important for our community and for our allies, is to unlearn, unpack ableism. Ableism lives inside of every human being. I think we are so enmeshed in an ableist world and an ableist culture that sometimes it's really hard to pick apart that. And I say that as someone who's been disabled since birth. I'm constantly unlearning and unpacking the ways that I internalize ableism, that I live and act out ableism. And so I think that the more that we can understand that and connect the dots to all other forms of oppression, the better. Ableism is literally the thread that binds. And I think that it's really important for us to call that out and to name that. And I think that, you know, it's really important for us to not take the rights that we have won for granted. And I think it's really important to understand that those are not going to be guaranteed. And even as David Dively was saying, like, we can have all the laws, right? But that doesn't mean that they're always practiced. And so I think it's really important for us to fight for our futures and also know that there's forces that are trying to take that away. I think that as I've come to do this work, the more and more I realize and understand that it's going to take all of us, that we can't leave anyone out, that every body, mind belongs in this movement, and that it's up to us to ensure that. It's at times when I've said, where is so-and-so? Where are people from rural communities? Where's the Black and Brown people? Where are people, you know, with different disabilities? Where are they? It's at tables when I've asked those questions, when I've been with state agencies and said, where are my people? Like, those are, I think, the moments that count. And I think at the end of the day, we have to hold the powers that be accountable, because I don't think other people will. We are still so invisibilized. I would tell the future generations to have courage, that it's going to be okay to use the rage that you feel in your heart for good, to let that empower you, to know that you're not alone. I have more to say, but I'm going to stop there.
This is David speaking. I would say to future generations of disability advocates that there isn't one way to do it right. that do better than us, be more effective, learn from our mistakes and learn from what you felt we've done well and move it into the future. Every generation has a new perspective and a new goal and a new way of thinking of things, and it doesn't make anyone more right or better of an advocate than anyone else, but it's just the change that we all go through, and I think those are meaningful differences. And speaking of differences and similarities, one thing that I really has been meaningful for me has been really taking the time to internalize what it would mean and what it means that every single person, regardless of disability or not, is fully and equally human as everybody else, and is equal value as a person and as a human, regardless of what market economies will measure their productivity or value in, or other things might evaluate who you are and your value as a person. That's not true, and we don't have to internalize those messages. And what it would look like if we really rejected those, I think, can be a really profound thought. And I'll just leave you with one last thing, which is that different disability communities do advocacy differently. If you look at the way that the DD community has advocated for changes and progress, as opposed to, for example, the deaf or the blind community, you see dramatic differences. There's a lot that we can learn from each other. And one of the big lessons that I've learned in the last 8 years of my life, moving away from a disability-specific advocacy, has been how much I've been able to learn from other disability communities about how to do this better. And for all of you, for many people in my experience working in this field, a lot of people have a lane, and that's where they live and they work and they play and they advocate in that lane, that disability community, that special interest advocacy area around housing or whatever, to really take the time to learn from other groups and other advocates. And there's a lot of good lessons that we can learn from each other, and we don't have to repeat the same mistakes.
Thank you. And Nikki, I know we're right at the time, so I'll be brief. I think children should attend their own IEP meetings, and they should begin leading their own IEP meetings. I think people should consider running for office, and if they're not running for office, they should be volunteering and assisting. I think we need vigilance, and so it's very easy to lose your rights. I think the ADA might be under threat, so might the Olmstead decision. I think people should learn to do their own research and work with others, but maintain their values. And we just can't forget those who are living in segregated settings. And my deepest thanks to Brittanie and to David. It's just been terrific to be on this panel with you. Thank you. Back to you, Nikki.
Thank you three. And I'm humbled and thankful to be here with you, and that all of you do the work that you do. And it was a very vibrant conversation. We hope that you're leaving this event today feeling energized about the possibilities for our future, ready to renew your advocacy in the fearless spirit and conviction of Lois and Elaine. It was our 3rd annual Olmstead Day celebration today. And so thank you again for joining us today and making this event a success. As a reminder, please take the Disability Inclusion and Choice Survey before June 30th. It helps shape the next Olmstead plan here in Minnesota. And be sure to stay connected with the Olmstead Implementation Office through their social media, newsletter, and website. On behalf of OIO, the Olmstead Subcabinet, and Leadership Forum, thank you to all our presenters today for your advocacy and sharing your stories and experiences with us. And thank you to everyone who joined us today to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Olmstead Decision. This event has been recorded and will be emailed to you next week, along with some of our resources shared today. With that, thank you again for joining us and celebrating disability advocacy. Happy Olmstead Day, everyone.